I run the Shopify Masters podcast, which has just broken through 5 million downloads. So I'm going to go over the top 5 things I've learned. So number 1 is that podcasts grow through word of mouth, but you must kickstart that word of mouth. So what does word of mouth mean? Word of mouth is powered by having exclusive, great content. So your content cannot be found anywhere else. If you have great content you're producing consistently that people cannot get anywhere else, that is how a podcast spreads through word of mouth, because there's not going to be any other recommendation that other people will give to your ideal listeners when someone's asking about podcasts like yours, right? Someone's looking for content like yours, a podcast like yours becomes an obvious option. That is how word of mouth spreads, but you do have to kickstart it. You can't just have a podcast and wait for people to come by and listen to it. You must kickstart the word of mouth. But when having a great podcast, meaning a podcast that has content that cannot be found anywhere else, that is how word of mouth continues to grow and grow your podcast. And the word of mouth listeners, the ones that you get from referrals, from the kind of listeners that you get because people are telling each other about it, are the stickiest and the best types of listeners to get. When I say stickiest, I mean the people that will come and listen to every episode and listen to you for years and years. Now, number 2 is that you want to borrow and leverage existing audiences. What I mean by that is that the mistake I see a lot of podcasters make, and that I made a little bit early on, was that I would try to get a listener one by one. So I will go and tell one person at a time, maybe even 10, 20 times a day, I'll look for a different person to talk to tell them about my podcast. That's me growing one listener at a time. It's much better to leverage and borrow existing audiences. What I mean by that is that you can have big name guests on your show and get them to promote the podcast for you. You can go on other podcasts and promote yourself and promote your podcast on these existing platforms, existing stages that already have a big audience. You can also do things which I've talked about in other videos where you can partner up with companies that have big email lists and interview their success stories on your podcast, which incentivizes those companies to share out your podcast. Right? So there's a lot of different techniques that I talk about in my other videos and in my other training, but the idea is don't build an audience one by one. Don't get a listener one by one. Look for opportunities to get in front of big crowds of people and leverage existing audiences. When I say leverage existing audiences, you don't have to use your own audience, right? You don't have one. Perfectly fine. Find ways to work with others to promote your podcast to their audiences, right? Borrow other people's audiences, borrow existing audiences. Don't try to grow a podcast one by one. But 3 is that your podcast is not going to be for everybody, and it really shouldn't. If you're going to with the mindset that I'm going to try to create content that everyone's going to like, it's going to be stale. It's going to be, bland and boring, and you're not going to attract an audience that way. It might seem like the larger, the more appeal you have, the more general appeal you have, the better for you. Especially if you're building a podcast that you're trying to target a very, very specific group of people that you want as clients, as ideal listeners. You want to create a podcast that's not going to be for everybody. I made this mistake early on where I was getting positive reviews on my podcast, positive, and I felt great. And then the first negative review came. And it wasn't anything like saying that my content sucked or anything. It just wasn't what they were looking for. And he left a negative comment. And I was almost ready to change up my entire content, my entire idea behind my podcast, just to appease this one negative complaint. So I was going to switch up everything that 99% of people like just to appease 1% of the people, right? So keep that in mind, is that your podcast does not need to be for everybody, and actually should not be for everybody. If you are creating podcast content and you can identify that this kind of content is good for a certain type of person, but not good for another type of person, you're on the right track, because you are not trying to create a general appeal podcast. You're being very focused in creating podcast content that's not going to be for everybody. Number 4 is creating unique content. That's going to be the biggest difference, right? You don't have to create the best, most well-researched, the longest, most in-depth podcast. It just has to be different content that people are not talking about. Topics that people are not talking about in your niche. Even if it is topics that people are talking about, what is the perspective that you bring? What is the unique twist that you can apply to the content that you're creating for your podcast? Make it unique. If they can find anywhere else, if they can find the answers, find the kind of content you're producing just by Googling it around or looking at any other podcasts out there or watching any other YouTube video out there, is not unique enough, and that's not going to build an audience, right? People will subscribe and tune into and be long-term listeners with podcasts that are creating, again, unique content that cannot be found anywhere else. And number 5 is be consistent. This is so key. It's a relatively long-term game, right? Starting a podcast, but once you get in there and once you build an audience of listeners, once you build an audience, they're never going to leave if you can continue to be consistent. Consistent means having a schedule where you show up every single day or every single week to record an episode. If you're doing a weekly episode, release at the same time every week, release at the same time of day every week, release on the same format, right? Don't change up anything crazy where you do an interview one week and next week you go on some like 3-hour rant, right? You want to keep it consistent because people will subscribe because they know what to expect. If they come in and you talk about, you have a podcast talking about relationships one week because you're a relationship coach, and then next week you talk about personal finances, and the people aren't interested in personal finance, they're going to leave, right? They're not going to feel inclined to subscribe. They almost feel like they cannot trust that you create content that they will like or that they'll find useful, and that's how people end up not subscribing or even unsubscribing, right? Consistency is key here. Consistency with showing up, consistency with creating content in a way that feels familiar to your guests, and always consistently sticking it out, for the long term, because it's going to take a while to build a podcast, right? Longer term, right? But the audience is going to be the most profitable audience you can build. Now, hopefully that helped you out. Now, if you want more help with launching or growing a podcast, especially if you're a coach or a consultant, starting a podcast, building a podcast because you want to build an audience of ideal listeners and clients, then I invite you to book a 45-minute no-cost podcast strategy call with me. On this call, we'll learn more about your business, your goals, how podcasting can or maybe cannot fit into your business model, your business. And it's really just to get a better feel for whether we can be a good fit to work together, right? If we're a good fit to work together, then I'll tell you more about my program, what's inside of it, what's involved, and answer any questions you have, all on the call itself. There's no cost to this podcast strategy call. There's also no obligation to buy anything. So at the end of it, if it is a good fit and for both of us and we decide to move forward, great, we'll talk more about that. If it's not a good fit, the worst thing you walk away with is more clarity on podcasting, how it fits into your business, and more clarity on your podcast strategy. So if you want to take advantage of this 45-minute podcast strategy call, all you got to do is click the link below and book your time with me, and I'll talk to you soon.